Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is first in a series of 6, presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 3. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to examine the whole of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 152, which initiates the mighty Scene 2-3 Interlude. It's often claimed Das Rheingold still labors under the Meister's earlier stylistic methods, even while making landmark advances. The Scene 2-3 Interlude is a prime example. It begins scenically enough on Fricka's last word, and with techniques well familiar to mid-19th century symphonic practice. Insidious Loge syntax dominates its first minutes, repeated in the way of a Beethoven development section, the episode en bloc taken for no more than sonic pictorialism, meaning the smoke and flames through which Wotan and the fire god descend into Nibelheim. On a deeper level, this initial portion underlines that from this moment forward, Loge takes ironclad control of the action, literally wrapping the god in his flames. After a chromatically rising progress atop 4 measures of tremolos on cellos violas, atop the strings pulses single measures of the chromatic scales in ever-strengthening woodwinds, contrabasses, each finished in chord notes, a subtle look forward to servitude, twice alternate with those of the chord note descent on strings alone, after which 4 climactic measures combine the 2 modules. Gradually augmented woodwinds and low brass trace scale oppositions, a mix of rising-falling chromatic lines, while ever more dense strings continue their descent pulses, powerfully swelling the crescendo's intensity. At the top of this arc, strings continue their descent strophes, mixed with woodwinds whose downward scalar inversions are bundled in semiquavers, followed by quaver chord notes, in the midst of which 4 descending sets of plunging octaves thunder forth on bass tubas and contrabasses, each octave group separated from the previous at a lower tritone interval. Not merely a graphic depiction of the god's descent, this is a stark invocation of nature's power turned hideously upside down, a fearsome revival of those falling octaves characterizing Albrecht in Scene 1. Wotan holds in his spear power filched from Erda, while plummeting into a realm where more of it toils away at still darker business, his ultimate aim to consolidate its perverted energy with his own. On an abrupt key change, low brasses seem to quench this unnerving racket with their own equally sinister idea, a mournful resignation strophe in the form Loge definitively hammers out during his panegyric, minus its sensual trill appoggiatura. It's a morpheme whose associations, thanks to Fricka, the panegyric, and more have expanded beyond threatened love to ideas of unnatural loss, frustration, and alienation from the feminine goddess principle. Cellos violas answer by slithering up 2 measures of Loge's rising chord note reversal, a morpheme cluster doggedly repeated 3 times, each raised harmonically, the second with its resignation module still on low brass, its third on mournful horns, after which second violins join the answering lower strings in a unique crib of Loge's chord note rise, begun on 2 semiquaver chord note oppositions, then twice lifting on fourths into single chord note strophes, the whole finished on an arpeggiated abandonment triad, capped in horns by a 4th and last resignation strophe. Skillfully charged with emotion and syntactically apt as it's been so far, only now does the interlude break free of its 19th century symphonic cope to radically veer into new territory. Cook is the one analyst to grasp the scope of this innovation. Wagner employs a flashback technique, which he often uses in orchestral interludes. He turns away from Loge and Wotan and their descent into Nibelheim and picks up Albrecht on his descent to Nibelheim from the Rhine after Scene 1. Albrecht's thwarted desire for love has turned bitter and is being transformed into a fierce lust for power, a familiar psychological phenomenon which is the true underlying meaning of the dependence of absolute power on the renunciation of love. I would go further. Still agreeing with Cook's assessment, I suggest the 4 resignation pulses themselves imply crosscuts between Wotan and Albrecht, 2 power figures locked in the same internal struggle. As a continuous timpani roll begins, cellos trade with ever-strengthening woodwinds 8 swift percussive air-de-chord repetitions, which Cook rightly identifies as a direct reference to Albrecht's misery over his rejection by the Rhine maidens. These acquire ever greater force thanks to double impacts of the woodwind's initial chords, a developing rhythmic module suggestive of resistance first bruited by the Nibelung's woe, then refined in giant syntax, which horns continue while cellos alone, then violas added, take up Freya's love cell to continue the echo of the dwarf's Scene 1 complaint. Punctuated throughout on their third beat by horns beating out the double impact, 4 double Freya strophes in 2 pairs rise harmonically by thirds. Joined by second violins, these concatenate into a non-stop hail of only the morpheme's first 3 notes, as in Albrecht's Scene 1 lament, their bundles of 3 cresting through 6 measures, each lifted a third, with first violins added on the first ascent, woodwinds joining the horn double impacts on the second measure of these. At the top of this climactic swell, the bass trumpet howls a Rheingold fanfare, while woodwind's horns freeze in a pedal and strings repeat 6 identical Welterb triads. This triggers the string choir to rage through a pair of extended ring iterations, interwoven with offset woodwind minim chord pulses until a trumpet joins its bass counterpart for a second clamorously louder octavo Rheingold iteration, atop which strings woodwinds at last launch the furiously pounding definitive Nibelung morpheme. It's the first moment this central morpheme sounds, one of the most direct syntactic transformations in the Ring, fulfillment of Loge's subtle prediction during his panegyric. While strings outline the idea's melodic shape, it's worth noting horns woodwinds set against them the syntax's distinctive rhythmic pattern which contributes so much to its unforgettable impression. The melody's downward turn is a harsh version of the Rhine Maiden's joyful dip, validating Cook's judgment. The Rhine Maiden's joy in the potentiality of the gold has been transformed into the Nibelung's misery in working on the gold. One which is also prepared for by resignation and the furious development of the dwarf's sorrow over his frustrations in love, meaning his cries of "Weh," along with the embryonic Freya module, forever sweeping away Volkswagen's misapprehension that last module is in any way related to flight. The next 4 measures bludgeon away at the Nibelung tattoo, without change, though notably with the 4th sinking thereafter in harmonic thirds, a procedure that outlines the Ring Fragment. Interlaced with these, octavo trumpets shift their Rheingold iteration to a baleful, slow and tragic pair of Freya strophes, that morpheme whose crucial role in Valkyr's love music Cook rightly defines. Porges confirms this beyond all doubt when he says of the passage, It is as though the spirit of love in the grip of the powers of darkness were uttering a cry of anguish. The total effect of the passage I can describe only by saying that it was as though we were being plunged into a hell on earth. The trumpet's Freya syntax flattens into chord notes, bass trumpet repeating a softer pulse of her love cell, the trumpet strophe above it, distorted and elongated by ending on reverse melody notes, which woodwinds echo at a parallax, lapsing into a single air to chord iteration sustained across two measures. These disappear, leaving horns, low strings to continue the tattoo's insidious outline. Another 3 love strophes sink even lower on trombone, finally capped by a last virtually inaudible reverse melody note strophe. As this progression begins, meaning when the woodwind's chord notes cease, the famed offstage anvils creep in. Their Nibelung iterations are shared across 3 trios of small anvils for 12 measures, while 3 large individuals alternate single crotchet strikes on the beat, echoed by 3 groups of duo medium-sized anvils whose quaver strokes sound off the beat, both large and medium in duple time, set against the small group's staggered triplet Nibelung rhythm. After 3 measures, the anvils steadily increase in volume, while the fading horns break off severally across 2 measures, strings through 5. In the midst of this, the trombones breathe a last pair of Freya strophes to end in reverse Erda melody notes, along with the uninterrupted timpani roll which has continued throughout since being launched by the final resignation strophe. The anvil's rhythmic offset proceeds through 4 measures without orchestra to crest at highest volume as the 3 groups of small anvils unite in 4 shattering tattoo measures, the crotchets of the large united on the beat, medium-sized together in quavers off the beat. The anvil contingent then returns to its original staggered configuration, meaning 3 small groups trading the Nibelung pulse between them as medium-size and large severally throb their duple crotchet quaver rhythms. On a side note, countless recordings and stage productions across the decades heroically strive to give this remarkable sequence its due, but as of the current writing, Scholte's first complete recording from the mid-1960s on London Records, now Decca, remains the benchmark thanks largely to the attentions of its sound engineer John Colshaw. As the anvils begin a long fade across 12 measures, violins, violas creep in with the melodic form of the Nibelung tattoo, while bassoons, low strings initiate a gradual climb on what seems a sort of inversion of the brass's previous Freya iterations, but with its own unique syntactic clues. Beneath the continuous violin-viola Nibelung ostinato, the melodic syntax launches in bassoon's octavo low strings on a broad statement of the air to chord notes, then leaps heroically up a fifth to another chord note pulse, this one elongated by a 3rd chord note iteration to produce a shape identical to the reverse melody notes. As the passage's intensity burgeons, this figure twice repeats, then, after a final swift chord note strophe, its last iteration produces a distinctive long-short rhythm, the first appearance of what Koch dubs servitude, traditionally considered an entirely new and separate morpheme, which its syntactic development here shows is unquestionably an Erda evolution specifically from her chords, through the reverse melody notes. As a final observation, the melodic line slurring, combined with the emphasis of its upward leaping notes, makes of this passage 3 strophes of Flosshilda's heroic figure, a potent mark of newborn Nibelung defiance as hideously empowered by the furious labor all around. A third servitude pulse leads to violins, violas, assisted by cellos, complicating their last Nibelung iteration with a pair of what eerily resemble the Rhine Maiden's taunts, complete with their 2 abandonment triads, strophes leading to the interlude's close. Sustained by wailing woodwind horn chords, strings repeat a module which is sounded throughout Scene 2, most prominently as Loge explains the ring's magic, moving Wotan to at last cement his resolve in having it. Yet only at this moment does the syntax truly claim its morphemic birthright. The Ring Fragment twice wildly descends, in 2 extended strophes, followed by a third and last that, as it continues to plunge into the depths, doubles the previous 2 iterations in length. It comes as no surprise that all these figures are comprised exclusively of overlapping Welterb triads. An extraordinary change, both mental and physical, is taking place throughout the entire Nibelung race thanks to their contact with and subjugation by the ring. Cook nor any other analyst notes the Ring Fragment or the Welterb triad, taking those as indistinguishable parts of the ring. Yet both Fragment and Triad have already declared muscular lives of their own, which they continue to manifest until very nearly the tetralogy's final bars, when the racial issues they connote here at last have been settled. The Fragment's original isolated appearance in Scene 1, an instant before Albrecht renounces love, a case which of needs includes its Welterb triad, leads to many other occurrences of both modules during Scene 2, all related to the frustrated sexual urge whose continued drive empowers the dwarf to forge the ring, yet which also emboldens Wotan's power-hungry racial cravings. Along with the reverse melody notes, as discussed in Scene 1, this module has as much to do with sexual reproduction as with a piece of jewelry or the lust for gold. One might even imagine the Meister singing to himself the words Welterbe each time he notated its triad in his score. The most reliable way to confirm its associative meaning is by putting it in what Cook rightly identifies as its narrative context, which the Scene 2-3 interlude particularly underlines. Driven by his frustrated need for love and procreation, Albrecht sublimates that urge into the enslavement of his Nibelung brethren, thereby making them his effective offspring. In the same way, Wotan travels down to Nibelheim in order to wrest that prerogative away from the dwarf so he may use it to empower his own domination over the world's races. Directly this passage ends, the scene opens on Albrecht doing just that to his blood relation Mima. Throughout Rheingold, the air de court notes, what Cook dubs servitude, often accompany stage pictures of dwarf hordes obeying their master, hence the rationale for that name. The Ring Fragment supplements this complex aspect of the ring's power, specific to the Nibelung race at this point. But, as its later importance to Hagen and Götterdämmerung suggests, the road doesn't end with Rheingold. Cook observes, if we were to continue with the broad social interpretation necessary for the Rheingold, we should find ourselves faced with unanswerable questions, such as, why, if this future is so rosy, does no one liberate the oppressed Nibelungs? Or at least, what happens to the Nibelungs when Albrecht lost the ring? Yet Pace Cook, as the drama unfolds, servitude, the Ring Fragment, and their variants yield surprising insights to that very question. If the faceless mass of enslaved Nibelungs disappear from the epic on stage after Rheingold, the race's descendants do not, with Hagen as proof. A deeper look both at the work's musical syntax and the Meister's own writings suggest unnamed dwarfish offspring have an ongoing role to play, one hitherto unexplored by the analytic tradition. The Scene 2-3 interlude, among the most accomplished in the Ring, despite its power and clarity, remains largely opaque to commentary. Volzogen mentions a few of its syntactic details without noting how the concepts they embody fit together. Kobe ignores the passage, and Newman finds in it no more than traveling music. Rationalizing Volzogen's mix-up over Freya's love cell, Hutchison opines rather amusingly the module's interlude variants describe the different walking strides of Loge and Wotan. Donington devotes nearly 4 pages to the interlude, with untypical focus on its musical structure. That's a testament to its impact inspiring a generic paean to the art of music. But outside its evocation of evil, he has surprisingly little to say about the interlude's definitive meaning. Sabor provides a more than usually detailed account of its structure and musical syntax, while doling out a mere handful of tantalizing words on love's toils in cruel Nibelheim. Cook alone pinpoints the interlude's full context while correcting Volzogen's error, his famous mistaking the Freya module for flight in the sense of escape and/or rapid physical movement. As befits the morpheme's genesis in Freya, Cook leaves no doubt it's the work's central expression of empathetic love, while revealing this interlude as a cinematic flashback, Alberich portrayed casting off that love as he hurries back from the Rhine to ruthlessly enslave his fellow dwarves. While quite true on a basic level, other fertile ideas are in play. The interlude's morphemes, all central to the epic's nature syntax, are present either in or immediately surrounding Loge's panegyric. Here, between scenes 2 and 3, they undergo dread mutations, in effect giving birth to a horrifying new world where the panegyric's benevolent natural powers twist into something utterly different. Nibelheim is awesomely vile, yet, in stark contrast to the domain of the gods, it's a place of thunderous activity that boils with malign vitality. The fire god's panegyric report to his supposed masters hints at what, here in this underworld, is already terrifyingly real and in an advanced stage of development. This strikes Wotan at the same time it does an audience. Resignation, whose 4 strophes appear early in the scene 2-3 interlude, evolves from renunciation through Fricka's lament for women into its definitive form during Loge's panegyric, not specifying Alberich, but instead answering Wotan's urgent need to secure his ill-gotten power. The interlude shows us not merely Alberich's powers opposed to Wotan's, but the underlying realities of that opposition as the god travels to confront it. Wotan is stalemated by the giant specifically due to Fasold's need for love. The god's bid to enslave nature's energy in service of his regime now depends on robbing that power in its most threatening mode from the Nibelung, an expedient forced on Wotan by his own callousness towards love. Plunging into the depths where he means to acquire this new tonic by stealing the ring, the god encounters a nightmare world where Alberich's quite different purposes banish love to exploit nature's forces a great deal more successfully than Wotan has done. It must seem to the immortal that turning nature's power to evil through lovelessness is more effective than turning it to good through love. It's this moral dilemma which Loge, covert master of those energies, brings him into the depths to consider. It's not the only lesson the fire god teaches, nor the first one Scene 2 provides, and, with his acute sense of dramatic tension, the Meister denies Wotan this primary insight, instead giving it to audiences through the initial quarrel between Alberich and Mima, one whose syntax further develops implication of the reverse melody notes, chord notes, ring fragments, and Welterbe triads. The 2 brothers enter on a brutal shift to Dupeltime, accompanied by that module Cook first identifies in Scene 1 as Alberich's personal morpheme, its repetitive series of chromatic cello twitches, each an unnatural down-up sign supported by minor mode erode chords on bassoon contrabasses, here in 6 repetitions will sound only once more after this to disappear from the syntax forever. What remains, suggesting Nibelungs throughout, are demi-semi-quaver scale modules darting up and down, and as here almost invariably on strings. Dragging Mime by the ear, his furious sibling laughs on rising thirds, demands his obedience to falling ones, then brams him tückischer Zwerg to a defiant pulse with its sense of threatened opposition. Erde chords on clarinets, bassoons, mix with fingered tremolo, cello, viola pulses, each capped by violins racing down triplet demi-semiquaver scales. Alberich's scold continues on 2 descending scales, followed by quaver rests, then 2 upward turns, the first capped by a rising third. He concludes rising on reverse Erde chord notes on what is effectively a low Whirldash interval, into a united string-figured tremolo in septuplets. After a down-up bounce on thirds, he barks Das feine Geschmeid, ironically on Flosshilda's heroic module, subtly tying back to its implications during the immediately prior interlude. Mime's cries of pain, chord notes first rising, then falling, dart amid their echoes in strings, leavened with scalar Nibelung twitches atop a gradually fading woodwind pedal, finally reduced to a pair of bassoons. The string chord note modules drive his vocal of 2 echoing Nibelung turn pulses, the first extended with a third bounce, the second a fourth down and third up. After a downward turn, Mime concatenates the heroic module with its defiant counterpart, a succinct expression of resistance together with its futility, whose high note the Meister asks to be sung grell for special impact. Albrecht demands Mime's handiwork, sinking on chord notes into a Nibelung turn from which, after 2 static notes, he falls a tritone to bounce up a third, a subtle nod to the power of his own lust for the ring. His brother equivocates a cappella between now hesitant string chord twitches, 2 echoing static note phrases ended in chord notes, the first enlivened by a static ash interval. String twitches renewed, Albrecht sees through Mime to chagrin. Then, after his brother sings the last feeble a cappella excuse on a single pitch, separated from chord notes by a dotted crotchet rest. His tyrant sibling contradicts him with chord notes, complete with the Welterbe triad and the jarring upward leap of a ninth. Then, over a stentorian woodwind pedal chord, demands Herr das Geschmeid to a plunging octave and rising fifth, both modules distorted echoes of Ringlust. It's worth noting this last exchange's wording is eerily like Wotan's scene 2 back and forth with Loge over the reason the fire sprite has been so long absent. Mime drops what he's been hiding, illustrated by strings, reinforced in a rich woodwind pedal chord, scampering up a chain of 3 reverse chord notes to end on an upward third. In the ensuing silence of a dotted crotchet fermata, Albrecht snaps up the trinket. He then gloats over his new prize as, icily quiet, its distinctive morpheme sighs forth on a quartet of muted horns. No analyst fails to identify this syntax, but only Cook explains its roots in Loge's music, specifically his magic fire module, which of course means Erde chords. The entire complex is built from 2 echoing strophes, each with its own separate and distinctive body, and coda, each of those with their own individual associative roles to play in the drama, though always connoting the Tarnhelm or, more precisely, its power over physical matter. A few repetitive modules lie at the core of the syntax's bouquet of meanings. The echoing portions of its first half describe a pair of upward turns. Those in its second pinpoint turns moving the opposite direction, the entire morpheme thus fraught with Erde chord oppositions and their reversals. The coda to each has its unique characteristics, the first being Erde melody notes shaped as a low ash interval, the second launched by a descending Erde fourth to include a third and last downward turn built from a final chord note reversal. In this, its initial appearance, only its first half sounds, over whose final sustained chord, Albrecht scolds his brother for holding out on him, his vocal entirely on tonic notes, launched by an inversion of the heroic melody notes, to progress up thirds through two static note triplets, making the line a broken but recognizable version of the abandonment triad, with its sense of betrayal. A harsh string pedal chord punches his contempt, sung on a static triplet to fall a sneering tritone, while cellos violas swell three pulses of a harmonically altered Tarnhelm-cell. The dwarf tyrant smirks at Mima's contemplated theft to three echoing but varied phrases. The first extends through a static triplet, then rises on melody notes into a little downward turn resembling his Scene 1 wooing, a sneer capped by a rising third. The next two strophes closely echo one another. The first of these launched with a low ash interval, the scene's first, this one almost minuscule on a second. Albrecht then climbs on contiguous, jeering pairs of his lust turns, the second in his phrase begun with a derisive grace, finished on reverse chord notes. The next phrase, a harmonic second above, trades the ash interval for a static triplet and third lift, its second turn denuded of its grace. Albrecht's wooing frustrations poured like acid over his hapless brother. With another jagged string pedal chord, Albrecht crows he sees through Mima, his voice leaping a high ash interval on a tritone to end with a ghost of fate. A strident double chord note opposition on strings resembling those modules punctuating his earlier tirade against his brother's distress leads to a fermata pause in which Albrecht places the device on his head, triggering the morpheme's first complete iteration. His vocal, during its initial half, admires its fit, a tiny detail the majority of productions ignore by opting for a shapeless mesh prop. This doesn't just render irrelevant Albrecht's comment on the helm's fit, it makes nonsense of the dwarf's vocal syntax, never mind obscuring pivotal clues in the morpheme's unique dual construction. Albrecht is full size during the Tarnhelm's first half as it supports his initial vocal, wondering if its magic will function. He moves through a Nibelung turn, capped by a plunging fifth, a ghostly chagrin echo, as well as a precursor to Loge's coming vocal habits. Then, after a quaver rest and static triplet on the previous F-flat, he leaps back up the fifth to outline a module flickering in and out of textures practically from the work's first vocal notes. Slowly acquiring a sense of defiant opposition without yet solidifying definitively into a morpheme, it will soon do so thanks to those powers his new bauble unleashes. Over the Tarnhelm's second half, and on two phrases precisely sandwiched between the notes of its two erta chords, he utters the spell making him invisible. His first incantation is a static ash interval, then an erta fourth drop, and after a minim rest, the second rises a low interval on a bold fifth. The Tarnhelm's second coda places a numinous wordless seal on the passage with its fertile conjunction of erta-centric syntax. Magical invisibility, thanks to some enchanted item, is common to numerous myths, fairy tales, and fantasies. Early 21st century audiences find its descendant in Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility. Yet it plays no part in Norse mythology since, due to the so-called Great Lacuna, any potential information about it is missing from the Poetic Edda. Both the Prose Edda and Volsung Saga explain that, to pass through Brunhilde's protective flames, Sigurd and Gunnar exchanged shapes as Grimhild had taught them. While some type of magic is obviously involved, the sources give no further details on what that sorcery is. The first item with such powers doesn't appear in the tradition unequivocally until Nibelungenlied, its Christianized medieval version. There, Siegfried acquires a magic cloak as booty when he defeats the Nibelungs, a tool he uses to trick Brunhilde into thinking he's Gunther, both during their trial of strength and when wrestling her to submission after she denies Gunther her bed. Spencer Millington posit the Meister added properties of teleportation thanks to his readings from Grimm. Productions of the Ring tend to handle this physical effect with little ceremony, Alberic usually draping some cloth-like prop over his head, after which he crouches out of sight behind a set element, a puff of stage smoke occasionally honoring the stage instructions request for a Nebelsäule. Needless to say, this woefully slights Wagner's brilliant sonic embodiment of the effect. This is doubly frustrating in that it also obscures, or at least pays no mind to, one of the Tarnhelm morpheme's key syntactic revelations. As a tool placing in other hands Erda's power of physical transformation, its morpheme is heaviest of all the epic's individual modules in her chords, 5 total, opposed by an equal number of their reversals. This subtly produces overlapping chains of chord note oppositions, with their own reversals, a sort of oral Mobius strip with its not entirely coincidental similarity to the infinity symbol or lemniscate. This aspect of the morpheme is only readily evident when it sounds in pairs, which it frequently does, as with the Vala's Siegfried Act 3 revelation of her powers, the Rhine Maiden's joy in the Rheingold, servitude, even Fafner's gloat over the aging gods. A host of other instances abound throughout the tetralogy, reinforcing the wave and tonic-dominant tonic aspects of its sonic DNA, while continuing to iterate Erda's covert hand in everything. Once invisible, atop the final Tarnhelm chord, held as a pedal, and to a crib of chagrin, Albrecht asks his brother if he can see him, who, after a pizzicato string quaver chord, admits he can't as he bounces a cappella on Erda fourths, followed by a static triplet falling a third, to produce an inversion of the heroic melody notes, in echo of his brother's earlier taunt. A wrenching flurry of rising-falling Nibelung demi-semi-quaver scales erupts interspersed with opposing chord notes, a heightened replay of Mima's earlier torments as the unseen Albrecht cruelly whips his brother. The singer portraying Mima usually delivers an awkward pantomime per the written stage directions, as if the invisible abuse were real. While the Copenhagen Ring manages the disappearing effect cleverly enough, even its Mima is reduced to this dumb show, a failing which must be laid at the door of Wagner's admittedly rather naive stage instructions. Valentia takes a more creative approach, which unfortunately is no more successful and every bit as awkward. Albrecht's vocal scolding leaps up a third to trace a Welterb triad through a dire inverted ash interval, to then bounce on thirds capped by an upward tritone, yet another mark of lusting after the ring's power. The tyrant dwarf continues after a crotchet rest, leaping up another third into Flosshilda's heroics, from which he plunges in another inverted ash interval on a raw sixth, repeatedly anticipated by identical second violin viola cells, whipped by rising first violin demi-semi-quaver scales, opposed by falling cello septuplets, woodwinds double Mima's howls, 2 on chord note reversals, then 2 on their originals, his last graced cry sustained by a dotted minim as the chord notes continue mingling with Nibelung scales. While the chord scales burgeon as woodwinds march up a tonic arpeggio on offbeat quavers, Albrecht caps the beating by laughing on a ring fragment, somewhere between its original and its elongation in the Scene 3 launch. He thanks Mima for his work with bitter irony to a pair of vocals, the first leaping up a sixth into a semi-breve woodwind chord as he intones a reverse ash interval on a second, which he elongates into reverse melody notes, the second bounding on a chord note opposition to then fall another second, making yet another reverse melody pulse. It sparks a wrenching shift back to triple time, frantic rising Loge scales in bowed semi-quiver strings, which at their tops spark Albrecht's fiery address to all his dwarfish slaves. He twice sings ho-ho on rising air de force, each echoed by harsh woodwind horn air de chord strophes, a detail which looks forward to that morpheme's most horrific transformation, along with repeating the double impacts first generated by Fasold's outrage at Wotan's duplicity. Topping this, the dwarf tyrant brays a unique yet already familiar syntactic module. This elevates to a moment of revelation what even the Meister himself might otherwise dismiss as Meyerbeerian effect for its own sake. It brings a key element of his sonic language one step closer to its final form, a module already prominent in various embryonic guises, though its significance so far hovers at a preconscious level. The dwarf's vocal, supported by unison woodwind horn octaves, launches a reverse ash interval, its concluding downward tritone and extended melody notes moving through a low ash interval on a second, after which he names himself to a baleful inverted interval on a grim plunging octave, his final cells adding up to a chagrin strophe. The orchestra simplifies this vocal module to clarify its unnatural down-up sign built from a falling interval followed by a rising scale, a retrograde of Flosshilda's heroic cell. Both modules sound throughout the drama to express two central yet antithetical ideas. Here, clearly Albrecht's fierce tyranny over his dwarfish minions through his distortion of nature's powers. Nor is a resemblance to the Nibelung term accidental, given the Rhine Maiden's tactically unwise joy in the gold reverses Flosshilda's defense of it, then comes to roost in the Nibelung's misery. Intriguingly, this distinctive syntactic line echoes those of both Wotan and Fafnir in Scene 2, and at the very moments when god and giant unwittingly embark on trajectories plotted for them by Loge. Here this module's similarity confirms the malign dwarf's brutal agenda is also part of Erda Loge's plans. Albrecht describes the torments his helpless race are to expect now he has the power of invisibility, while chromatic tremolo string chords reinforced by clarinets trace an ironic pulse of that anti-giant turn, Wotan's plan to rob him through Loge's advice. They continue through chromatic extended melody notes, then trace an elongated pair of ring iterations resembling its embryonic form, complete with its almost merry harmony. While this reminds an audience the dwarf even now wears that dread bauble, its harmony also telegraphs his own fierce joy in that knowledge. His brief, furious address initially dances across the orchestra's reverse melody cells, his first vocal pulse, a pair of static ash intervals, rising into a Nibelung turn and capped with a descending fourth, making it a distortion of his immediately prior vocal, also informed by chagrin. His next phrase lifts a low ash interval on a second, followed by a static triplet and another second lift ended by a plunging octave, both lines essentially tracing melody notes while adding up to another chagrin strophe. Ironically, his vocal goes on to oppose the orchestra's first falling-rising ring module with a rising-falling-rising sign, its initial pulse opposing the giant turn, while recalling Loge's advice to Wotan on stealing the ring. Atop the second, he rasps a pair of chagrin iterations, their sense of unexpected reversal ever more powerful, the last balefully capped by yet another plummeting octave. The dire coded to this hail of threats booms his prior defiance across both voice and orchestra, horns, bassoons doubling Albrecht's declaration that his former brethren are now forever his abject minions. Kicked off by a Nibelung grace, low strings ooze down from this bundle to make it a vocal orchestral echo of the falling, rising, falling shape first declared by Fasold's wordless outrage. The dwarf tops his imprecations with two cries of ho-ho on rising sixth, ertichords on trombones, bass, tubas now distorted into plunging thirds, a gauntlet thrown into the Earth Mother's face, their rhythm picking up the double impacts of the giant's protest. These strophes double in speed while changing to rising thirds as Albrecht rages vocally on a Nibelung turn, cementing its resemblance to his latest warning module as he threatens, "Hört ihn not." Then, sustained by a horn woodwind pedal, he leaps up a brutal minor seventh to dub himself Lord of the Nibelungs in a broad Welt-Erb triad, meaning the first three notes of the Ring Fragment, his last three notes outlining a reverse ash interval. Loge's rising chromatics, again in strings on bowed semi-quavers, sustained by a trumpet woodwind pedal chord with timpani roll, usher in a brief shrieking interlude as Albrecht hurries to do the evil he's just threatened. The scene's inky minor mode shifts briefly to wild major to reflect his furious glee, never mind pronounce Erda's perverse benediction on this spectacle. All horns unite on a single pitch and, with the timpani, pummel the Nibelung tattoo while frantically graced violins, violas repeatedly leap up an octave, then down two. Simultaneously, trombones growl 6 ertichords as masked woodwinds extend a multi-octave trill appoggiatura across these three measures, after which the major mode plunges back into minor, Erda's hand tight on the controls. But it's even worse, at least for the as-yet unseen gods, a notion this brief interlude syntax goes on to explore. Middle strings take over the Nibelung tattoo as woodwind's horns pound away at graced rising octave, chord stings, and evocation of the sparkling anvils whose rising octaves suggest the pure world ash energy as it's released by the Nibelung's toils. Beneath this racket, tuba's low strings 3 times roar chord notes, Cook's servitude, its association now explicit thanks to Albrecht's peroration. The octave leaps subdue into unharmonized strokes, focusing on the bass, which introduces a unique syntactic variant destined to impact some of the work's most unexpected revelations. During Loge's Scene 2 panegyric, where Cook's servitude evolves towards an independent morpheme, the fire god hints at a sea change in the Nibelung race thanks to the Rhine Maiden's joy distorted by Albrecht's theft of the gold. The link between this and the reverse melody notes in the Scene 2-3 interlude further develops here, where the chord note strophes trigger reverse melody note iterations, stomping down a pungent chain of crotchet pulses, an evocation of the helpless slaves marching in lockstep. While the Scene 2-3 interlude implies Albrecht's frustrated passions enslaving his fellow dwarves, Albrecht's latest peroration and the brief interlude following it add a new element to these ideas. The threatened punishment, which he then proceeds to mete out, can't help but destroy the weak, while hardening those who survive. Fausselt and Fafner speak of dwarfish campaigns against them, events which must therefore predate Albrecht's theft of the gold. This means not all Nibelungs are the gentle artisans Mime portrays in his coming Arietta. With Albrecht as their leader, warrior Nibelungs exist before the events of Rheingold, a group whose numbers and strength the Tarnhelm's newly acquired powers must increase if the dwarf is to spread his tyranny into the world above. A key syntactic detail of this interlude is the seemingly meaningless coloration of its leaping octaves. In accompanying the bass cells, they lose their third double octave plunge to become a series of rising octaves alone. If, as this analysis maintains, falling octaves connote nature's power in the negative, and rising ones its positive force, there must be some natural boon Erda means for this nightmare to produce. These still nascent ideas continue spreading their covert but enormous implications for the Nibelung backstory across the epic. After the last strophe of this magisterial descent, octavo low strings take over the Nibelung tattoo, while trombones and low winds resume servitude. 3 identical strophes followed by 3 chromatically syncing iterations, the glinting cell reduced on horns to single-graced octaval pulses on the 3rd beat of each measure. This quieting mood, assisted by a key change to G minor, still taps out the tattoo on bassoon contrabasses, while octavo horn graces collapse into unisons, as low brass tint the last 3 servitude iterations with harmony, making them genuine erdichords in that dark minor version, soon to become a principal element in another of the work's most recognizable morphemes. All previous analysts base their evaluations of the erdichord notes mainly on their prominence in this initial portion of Scene 3, which is certainly where they make a striking impression. But as noted in these videos, they've already played a continuous if subtle role throughout Rheingold's first 2 scenes. Confusion over this morpheme has existed since the tetralogy's first performance. Volkswagen agrees with Cook, as do Holman and Lee, but theirs are not the only opinions. Newman calls the chord notes generic expressions of grief, and Donington takes him at his word, as does Sabor. Only Millington seems to understand that the erdichords and their note version, Cook's servitude, are transformations of the same core morpheme, though he doesn't identify their source in erda or catalog the full extent of their presence in the work's syntax. These commentators offer relevant insights into the various erdichord transformations, but none recognize the central idea uniting them, meaning the Earth Mother's powers as she manipulates the life forms of her world, her dreams slowly evolving them from these first baleful incarnations into their better. We'll resume with the next video, and the god's arrival in Nibelheim. It picks up where this one leaves off, Dover's full score on the 2nd stave of page 171. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.